Well, it began on a boat in the middle of Loch Ness, or it seems to have done. We, Mrs. and I, were on honeymoon, and we went on a boat trip, and the tour guide wasn't best pleased that there were only two of us. I think he wanted a lot more, didn't he? And he made that very plain that he wasn't very happy about it. And and I wasn't especially happy. I have to say, when it ended up being all about the Loch Ness monster, I was rather worried about that. I thought perhaps we were going to talk to somebody who was going to try and persuade us that this was something that existed. In fact, he wasn't. He was somebody who'd been there since the 60s and had done all sorts of scientific investigation, been involved in all sorts of investigations. And he had an answer for every argument to say that there was a Loch Ness monster. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating to hear how the surges from boats made these sort of serpentine coils in the water that could be misinterpreted. But I didn't have any questions to ask him, really. So I asked him at the end about the private life of Sherlock Holmes, and that made him laugh. Because he was there. He was there at the time, and he was still amused. He was still found it hilarious that he was there when their model Loch Ness monster sank. He still found satisfaction that this had happened, and I think that was the spark. Really, I was thinking about these opposing forces: the Hollywood film crew and the scientists looking for evidence of a Loch Ness monster, and how they wouldn't really get on. So that was the beginning of it. And then it was 2 years before I put pen to paper and started writing it. But from there on, it just flowed. It was like fully formed story. Went away, and these characters, Jim and April, formed in my mind over the next couple of years. Neither of them are based on anyone historical. April particularly is a lot younger than the actual continuity girl on the private life of Sherlock Holmes, who was the legendary Elaine Shreyek, who was already a veteran by that point, had worked with Marilyn Monroe on the Prince and the Showgirl in the 1950s, and was known in the business as the Duchess. So she was this formidable character. Worked on all the James Bond films in the 1970s as well. So this isn't her, This is a half Californian and much younger woman. And Jim is me when I'm most disgruntled, partly, but he's based on some other slightly disgruntled people I've met in my life as well. I think partly there's that interest that we have in fan fiction. Our relationship to the stories that we consume is very different now. So I wanted that to be reflected in the 2014 element, but also to look back at maybe where those sorts of things were beginning in the 60s when things were breaking down a bit. And I think that's an interesting thing. There's some political undercurrents, maybe. The 2014 part of the story is set in the run-up to the independence referendum and that febrile atmosphere that was around then. Now, that seems like a dry run for what happened in 2016, with all of the arguments about identity and nationality and questions about where we come from and where we belong. So I wanted to reflect a little bit of that. Looking back at the 60s, at 1969 was another time that was coming to the end of something, that things were changing, where there'd been this decade of all sorts of turmoil, some of it very positive, some of it actually perhaps getting quite bitter by 1969. And it's an interesting, again, febrile time to set something. You had the moon landing. You had things changing in the arts at that point, I think, as well. You had the big generation gap that was causing problems at that point. You have wonderful things happening, and then you have terrible things happening. Vietnam War is at its height, for instance, and the sorts of clashes that were happening within different groups in society that seem quite similar to now in some ways. Well, I have my two protagonists really. In 2014, I have Gemma, who is the product of a mixed marriage. So her father is Scottish from Glasgow, and her mother is a second generation Jamaican immigrant, and that means that she has to make certain choices about who she is, whether she wants to or not, because that's how those things go. Jim is in a much milder sense, but a sense that I think makes sense in Scotland in 1969. He's from the north of England. He hasn't travelled very far, and yet he's somebody who never, for a moment, in the 45-year span of the novel, believes that he's Scots. I chose to go through Unbound because I discovered them by chance by buying one of the books they produce. It was the Wake by Paul Kingsnorth, and it's a fantastic book. And it struck me that this is a wonderful way to get a book published. To in the first instance you send to an editor, but then it's the readers who decide. You put it out for crowdfunding, and if the readers like the idea, they will fund it. This makes Unbound a brilliant choice for a debut novelist, and it means that you're fighting alongside, you're fighting for attention alongside established writers and other new writers, and you have a chance to see your book in print and on shelves. The advantage you have with Unbound is this direct relationship that you build with readers. Straight away, you are reliant on readers, on people who are interested in your work, supporting you and becoming part of what you do. Readers will have access to my writing shed and read about the process, that creative process. That's something I've valued in recent years, is listening and watching other artists talk about the way that they produce their work, and there's something really special about being let in to that